Today here at Thrive in the Word, we're in 1 Peter, the 4th chapter, verse number 2. Now, if you didn't have the opportunity to listen to the last podcast, you need to go back and listen to it. So many people have taken these verses and they've misconstrued them. They've brought in this idea into these verses that in order for us to live a life of purity, that we need to live a life of suffering. Well, I've got news for you. Jesus suffered so that we could rule and reign over the principalities and powers in our life. What we need is this attitude. What we need is we need to make a resolution in our lives, like Peter said, in arming ourselves in verse number 1 of chapter 4, arming ourselves, getting ourselves prepared, getting ourselves equipped to resist the enemy, to resist darkness, to resist evil. Now, today we're going to look at verse number 2. And verse number 2 is a continuance of verse number 1. But it says here, so as to live the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for the lusts of men, but for the will of God. Why do we suffer? Why do we resist? Why do we come against the enemy? We come against the enemy so that we will no longer live our time here on earth in the flesh, giving ourselves over to our carnal flesh, to our carnal minds. You see, suffering does not make you pure. Do you understand that? That's not what Peter's saying. You know what? If suffering made you pure, those people in Bangladesh, those people right now in the Ukraine, those people throughout Africa, all those third world countries, they would all be saints if suffering made you pure. But it doesn't. What Peter is talking about is your intention. What Peter is talking about is you setting your mind and me setting my mind against sin. And if we will do that, if we will rise up and say, no, I am not going to give in. Flesh, you are not going to get what you want. You know what will happen? All of a sudden, we will find ourselves putting to death the lusts of men. Now, very quickly, what is a lust? Well, a lust can be any out-of-controlled desire. You know, you can lust for food. You can lust for sex. Now, a lot of times when preachers preach, that's what they talk about. But that's not the only lust. You can lust for power. You can lust for fame. You can lust for money. I mean, lust is just basically an out-of-controlled desire. Well, how do you overcome lust? How do you overcome lust? Again, and I'm repeating myself over and over, and I'm not repeating myself because I forgot what I was going to say or forgot what I've already said. I'm saying this so you understand. The way that we overcome lust is by setting our intentions, by arming ourselves, as Peter said in verse number 1, against these things, by resisting the evil. Jesus died. Not only did he die, but he rose again, and he is seated right now at the right hand of God the Father, but he's seated in a place of authority. And we as believers are seated in that same place. But if we don't have this attitude, this intention, that we are going to arm ourselves and resist the evil, you know what? We are going to continue to walk in the lusts of the flesh. Now let's go back to verse number 2, to the end of the verse. But for the will of God. You see, On one side of the road is this ditch called the lust of the flesh. And what happens is when we give ourselves and we stop resisting this lust, when we stop resisting those temptations, what happens? It pulls us away from the will of God. The will of God, let's just say, is the middle of the road. It's the place that God has given for us. It's the path that God has given for all of our lives. But if we're not careful, we get over into this ditch. And when you get into that ditch has a pull on it that's going to pull you away. It's going to pull me away from the will of God. It's going to pull me in a direction that God has never intended for me to go or for you to go. So understand this, that we need to resist. And in our resistance, even suffer persecution, suffer the abuse from other people. But we need to resist the evil of just following after the lusts of our flesh. And in doing so, we automatically pull ourselves and keep ourselves in the will of God. Now, I run into many believers, and they said, I'm just struggling to do God's will. I'm struggling to do God's will. Why are they saying that? Well, what they're really saying to me is that they're struggling in their flesh. They're struggling with temptation. They're struggling with this thing that's trying to get them to yield to sin. And how do you struggle with temptation? Well, you don't struggle with temptation by saying, okay, I'm not going to think about it anymore. How many of you know that doesn't work? You struggle with temptation by resisting it, by taking your place of authority. That's really what Peter is talking about. Not by crawling over a field of glass and suffering in your flesh. That's not going to help you in overcoming temptation. What's going to help you in overcoming temptation is realizing, first of all, that Christ rules and reigns over sin, and that you are seated with him, and that you need to arm yourself and you need to resist sin. Resist it. And in your resistance, you know what you're going to do? You are going to walk right down the center of God's will for your life. And God's going to allow things to happen that are going to just propel you on into the future. He's going to bring you to the place that he's called you. He's going to bring you to the place that he's equipped you. But first of all, there needs to be this attitude: I am arming myself against the lust of the flesh. I'm arming myself against sin. I will take my place, and I will walk in the authority that Jesus has given for me. If you'll do that, you'll live in freedom, and you'll live right smack dab in the middle of the will of God. I hope that this has blessed you. I hope that you join us again, and may God bless you until we speak to you again.